And one of the things I always think about when we talk about temptation is the three most famous temptations. And they're the kind of the best that the devil has to offer. When he's going to go after somebody, these are the top three choices that he will use. And though we don't have time to do it, you could find a way to fit all of the temptations that we find into one of these three categories. So when we look at the types of temptation, what would you do if someone asked about the lust of the flesh?
Well, to begin, just thinking about those three categories, I think pretty much all temptation to sin fits, like you say, under these three. You could go through the Bible and just kind of list out, here are examples of each individual and where their temptation began, how it fits in there. And so all that is in the world, this is 1 John 2:16, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And so these are temptations that we face, and James mentions, I just want to go ahead and get these verses in there, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own lust or desires and enticed. And that's part of the conversation that I know we want to continue to have through this. And when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. And so there's a process that's taking place. The temptation, what we have to remember, the temptation is the temptation to sin.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily sin to be tempted, because we're all tempted. The temptation, if we give in by our own desires, then leads to that. And so certainly I think of the lust of the flesh. And in my mind, I go to the beginning. I go to Adam and Eve and use that as an example, because you can see each one of those different types of temptations as well in the conversation taking place with the serpent and with Adam and Eve. And so if you look at Genesis 3, the whole stage is set because obviously when you think of flesh, the flesh needs what? The flesh needs food. We're talking about, our physical bodies, we have to have food.
Right.
Well, God had supplied all that they needed in the garden, right? And, he gave them everything, but he also then gave them boundaries. The fruit from the tree that it's in the midst of the garden was off limits, and so they were to stay away from that. Though, yes, it also yielded food, in other words. But then the temptation that is set by the serpent says, you shall not surely die, also directly connected to the flesh, if you think about that. But he goes on to say, God knows in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be open, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And that leads into the other areas as well. But what we find in verse 6, the woman saw the tree was good for food. It was good to produce food. The food was what they would need for their fleshly bodies. And so here was a temptation. The problem was that obviously Satan had said, you'll not die by doing this, but your body needs food. If you don't eat, it will die.
Right.
And so he's using that, the flesh to begin with, to draw in. And so there was this appeal directly to the flesh, life, the sustenance that they would need for life. And so that's where kind of this idea, I think, begins. And so looking at the first sin, if you will, kind of sets the stage for some other discussion I know we're going to have.
Yeah, well, I have always heard Genesis 3, the main place we go. But it dawned on me as I was studying for this and thinking about it, there's another place that I'm sure we're not going to be the first that have ever talked about it, but I do think it deserves to be in the consideration because, and it's not to discredit Genesis 3, obviously it's important, it's in there for a reason, but I'm not going to be faced with Genesis 3 the same way they were.
Right.
But there is an example that is right on our level that every one of us can relate to in some form or fashion, and that's in 2 Samuel 11. Yeah. And we have, and I've got to skip ahead of the verse that talks about the next one we're going to talk about, but it's the tail end of this where David says, hey, I want to know about this woman. And he brings, her, calls for her, and they had an affair. I mean, there's no other word that we can use for that. She was a married woman. He had no business being with her, and it was the lust of the flesh
Right.
that caused him to want to do that. This will feel good. This will make my body enjoy what I'm experiencing. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to chase that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And we often look even at Joseph and how he did not succumb to the lust of the flesh. And he said, I can't do this great wickedness and sin against God. I'll say more about this later on in the episode because we've got the pride of life as well. There's something about verse 1 that puzzles me when I then read that what we're talking about is David going up onto this roof, and the lust of the flesh and the eyes are really the main things we normally talk about. But that third one is certainly within this text, and we'll get to that. But I think about David as a man that when he saw her, the sin was not noticing that she was beautiful. I mean, if the sin is just noticing beauty, we've got problems because man did have the design in his very nature to notice beautiful women. The sin was when he lingered.
Right.
The sin was not that he saw her bathing, though that can certainly be a problem. Most times that we talk to people, maybe there's been a situation in someone's life where they accidentally saw something they didn't intend to see.
Right.
That happens.
Sure.
We're not exempt from that. The problem has never been accidentally stumbling into something. But you don't accidentally stumble into an affair. That does not happen. There's no way to accidentally commit adultery.
Right.
There is an intent behind that. And that intent is, I think, coupled so, perfectly with 1 John 2. Mm-hmm. The idea of do not love the world or the things that are in the world. And the lust of the flesh is an override of my soul that I allow to happen.
Right.
That I say, I don't care that this is wrong. And I want to make it clear, and I know that you would agree with this, it has never been the case that my body is too powerful to be overcome. It is that I allow myself to stumble in these ways.
Right.
I can say no. I have the dominion over my physical body, but sometimes you'll hear people, especially in the Missionary Baptist Church, a lot of times you'll hear some of those individuals say, well, the flesh is too powerful. The soul knows that it's wrong, but the flesh is too powerful, and so it just can't stop it. It's going to happen no matter what. And my dad debated a man who, one of his very members of the congregation where he preached, that's what he was saying was you could do whatever you wanted. Well, wouldn't it be wrong? It would be, but the flesh is too powerful. Well, that's false doctrine.
Right.
And I don't mean that to be unkind, but it needs to be said that that's what that is,
Right.
because we're not told in James that we're incapable of overcoming temptation. If that were true, Jesus was doomed the moment he was sent to the earth. But we're told in the book of Hebrews that he's tempted in all points as man is tempted, yet
Right.
without sin. Jesus faced the temptation of the lust of the flesh.
Right.
We could certainly talk about the fact that in Matthew 4 and Luke 4,
Yeah.
I'll get it right eventually, that Jesus faced these same three temptations, that when the
Absolutely.
devil went to play, in the big leagues, I mean, this is the big leagues,
Mm-hmm.
he brought these three temptations: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And there's nothing new under the sun, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, so we know that he hasn't changed his operating strategies.
Right.
It's still effective. It's still the best way. It's still the most effective way to get people to stumble. But what, John writes in 1 John 2 is don't love the world or the things that are in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And though I don't agree with the mentality that we are overridden because our body is so powerful, I believe that we can certainly turn off our Christianity and say, I'm not going to do what's right here because I'd rather do this because it sounds more enjoyable or it will be more enjoyable. I know that it's wrong. People often talk about after they commit a transgression, especially with some of the things we'll talk about this season as we are looking through temptation. Some of the temptations that we'll be discussing, people say that as soon as they have finished engaging in that temptation, they feel shame and remorse. They feel guilt. And they're frustrated with themselves. They're upset that they allowed that to happen. Well, it's not that they couldn't stop it before it happened.
Right.
It's that they allowed themselves to be overcome with the lust of the flesh. in this particular case. David certainly had done that. Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I would say that when you're going back and you look at how James lays that out, he's talking about when he's drawn away by his own desires. We have within us desires. There are fleshly desires. There are things that are pleasant to the eyes that also, by the way, appeal to the flesh.
That's right.
So it's hard. It's almost hard to separate those two, though there is a difference, obviously.
Yeah.
But one obviously is connected to the other, and I think all of these are probably very very connected. The idea of even pride of life obviously leads into some other areas as well. So when I think about David, and when I think about here's he during that time of year he was supposed to be off doing something else. He was supposed to be off at war. But he sees this, and it's the idea with flesh. There's a draw to beauty. There's a draw to fleshly needs and desires, and specifically that's why God puts many of those within the bounds of marriage. And so there's a boundary for some of those fleshly desires. But you think about what was going on with David, and sometimes we talk about this, especially with young boys when we're teaching, and stuff like that. We start talking about, it's not seeing beauty and seeing a beautiful woman. It's the idea of, okay, if I keep driving around the block because I see her and I'm catcalling her over and over and over,
Right.
because that's when it becomes a problem, obviously. So. Understanding, yes, we have those desires, but we also have the ability to tamp those back down where they need to be.
Well, and that's the sad nature of this too. God has blessed man with an ability to enjoy the flesh.
Right.
From a scriptural standpoint.
Sure.
That God says, I'm not against you having fun.
Yeah.
But it needs to be within the guidelines of what I have designed.
Right.
And it's the same thing. This seems like such a elementary example to give. It's the same thing when someone goes to like the go-kart track and they're told you can ride the go-karts, but what do they always tell you? You have to do it based on these rules.
Right.
Otherwise, you get kicked out.
Right.
God says in a much grander stage and a much higher of importance, example, I'm not against you having fun. And the marriage bed is undefiled.
Right.
You can enjoy being married, but you need to be married.
Right.
And when we look at the lust of the flesh from the sexual side of these things, it is almost always the case that the people who are struggling with that are going about this in a way that is unscriptural. And the things that they end up struggling with are the things where, as you mentioned, I see this beautiful girl running or around the block, and I feel like I should take another lap for her safety's sake and make sure no one's going to come and get her. And that is where the problem begins.
Right.
And that person's not your spouse.
Mm-hmm.
It's not somebody that you're supposed to be looking at that way. And that's where the lust of the flesh can become a massive problem for us.
Yeah. Well, and I would just add back in there too, kind of where we started with this, even with the idea of food, because I enjoy food.
Yeah, sure. Same.
I enjoy eating.
Yeah.
And I like good food, and so, and I'm particular about that. I like good coffee, and those things are enjoyable. But I obviously I can't just eat all day long every,
Right.
like there has to be some limits to those things.
Sure.
And so you can get in trouble, obviously, and people do.
Sure.
And I have in the past. So
Sure.
I get that. I understand, even the lust of the flesh as it pertains to food. So you could take that into other areas too. So.
Well, that brings us to something that works. Sometimes people have said my eyes were too big for my stomach.
Right.
And certainly when we think about the next temptation, the lust of the eyes, I think that's a good analogy, good illustration to use. I'll tell on myself. Years ago, we went to a buffet. I think I've told this on Did That Really Happen? So if anybody's watched that or listened to it, they will have heard this story before. But a shameless plug for Did That Really Happen, too. It's a good program.
Check it out.
Yeah, it'd be great. But on this particular occasion, we went to what was called Fire Mountain. It used to be Ryan's, then it turned into Fire Mountain. Now it's vacant. So
Went the way of West
yes,
Virginia.
that's right. It did not make it. Well, that night I went and got tons of food on my plate. You know, I was probably 9 or 10, you know, and I remember getting back to the table and seeing the mountain, it's probably why they called it Fire Mountain,
Yeah.
of food that I had on my plate. And I thought, I'm not going to eat this rotisserie chicken breast that I picked up. This, you know, I'm just not going to eat it. So somebody else should have the privilege of being able to eat that. And I went and I took it and I put it back with the rest of the chicken there.
Yeah.
And I thought I had done this great thing, you know, this selfless act of, you know, a child's
Thinking of
mind.
others.
I'm trying to help you all. You know, I was told my whole life there are people that would love to have the meal that you're eating right now. And I thought, well, maybe someone here tonight is thinking that. I was amazed when this woman came out in a hurry and took all of the chicken and threw it out. And I remember thinking, well, what, you know, and if I remember correctly, this might not have been on Did That Really Happen, but if I remember correctly, my dad wanted some of the rotisserie chicken and didn't get any yet. And I remember him asking, where'd the rotisserie chicken? Did you see any? You've got some. And I said, well, and I told him what I had done. My eyes were too big for my stomach.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes our eyes are too big for our soul. And they get us into trouble. They put us into a particular bind and corner that we would not be in otherwise. And so what would you do if someone says, what is the lust of the flesh? But what about the lust of the eyes too? We know the flesh, but how do the eyes play into this?
Well, just thinking about your story with the eyes bigger than your stomach, I was going to make that statement one day and messed it up, as I
boy.
sometimes do.
Yeah.
So I just said, my eyes are bigger than my head, you know, which
Yeah.
makes no sense.
No, it doesn't.
Unless you're talking about, you know, Japanese cartoons, you know, and things like that. So you
Anime,
know, really
yeah.
big eye, yeah. So, but the eye's bigger than the soul. Eyes, and you can think about eyes bigger than the head. Actually, has probably a spiritual application. Thinking about, I know better.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I know I'm not supposed to see these things and continue down this path. But again, we like beautiful things. We like pretty things. You know, so and even going back to Genesis 3, she saw that it was pleasant to the eyes. She saw it. It was pleasant to her eyes. So it was something that not only looked edible, but it looked like it would be good.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, you know, you start thinking about that, and then you go back to, as James explains this process, drawn away by his own lusts, and he's enticed by that. And so often it's the case that it's through the eyes that avenue began, if you will. You know, the eyes were the avenue to the lust of the flesh, you know, or something like that. That it was seen. And so this obviously leads into some other areas. I know this season we're talking about some of these different things, pornography and stuff like that. And when you start thinking about the lust of the eyes, there is an appeal in some way through the eyes, you know, and I think it's, you know, in Job, you know, I'll make a covenant,
Yeah.
you know, with my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so when you start thinking about, okay, I have to protect that. Why? Because that is the avenue through which the vehicle, if you will, through which it's leading me down this road, this path that I'm not supposed to be on, and I know better. You know, because immediately when somebody usually sees something like that, even a younger child, they see something, they know immediately, you know, a lot of the immediate reaction, usually to turn away. Now, they'll sometimes turn back and go, "Oh, what am I looking at here?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then trying to see further, you know, down that road. But usually the first reaction to seeing something that we're not supposed to see is, "Oh, it's a shock
Mm-hmm.
to the system." The problem with the lust of the eyes is if I continue to go down that road, it's no longer a shock to my system, but rather it's a desire that's drawing me in down that avenue towards sin.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why when you start thinking about even the temptation to Jesus, you know, Satan used this the lust of the eyes as well. You
Right.
know, look at what all you could have, all these, all this out there. And so when I start thinking about how that affects us, you brought up David earlier. You know, this is, you know, he's gone up to the rooftop and he sees her on the rooftop, and instead of going, oh, I need to give her the privacy that she deserves, no, I'm going to step here and I'm going to linger and I'm going to watch.
Right.
You know, and how many times did this happen over us? You know, how often did this happen? How long of a span did this continue on? We're not given all of those details, but it led him down a path. What reads almost immediately, I want her.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was. I see her beauty, I see her nakedness. I want her. And it was progressively going down that road.
It's an incredible thought, too, that I've heard people say it this way sometimes when we talk about the lust of the eyes. I saw something, and I couldn't explain why I liked it. There was just something within me was like, I don't understand why, but I'm enjoying what I'm seeing.
Sure.
People often talk about that with pornography.
Yeah.
They have no idea what they're looking at yet. They know that it's wrong, like you said, an initial shock. But then some have described it as saying, but then I couldn't explain why I'm enjoying what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the danger with the lust of the eyes is we're very visual creatures.
Right.
All of us.
Yes.
There are things that naturally draw our attention. And when I look at 2 Samuel 11, for example, there's a couple passages that I think that are kind of impressive that they're put into this particular area where it says saw a woman bathing. Genesis 34:2, when Shechem took a person and lay with her and violated her. That's the idea of what was being shown here. Exodus 20 and verse 17, you'll not covet your neighbor's house, neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox, donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Well, that's certainly what David is doing at this point. I've made a covenant with my eyes, Job 31:1. That won't be the last time we talk about this season. But why then should I look upon a young woman? And of course, Matthew 5:28, I say to you, whoever has looked on a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The idea of looking and seeing this woman bathing, I think it's impressive that you made this point too, because I've often wondered that. And the text doesn't tell us. I don't want to speculate and read into the text. But it is a strange thing that this is the time of year when the kings go to battle and David stays behind, and then it happened. Almost as if what the writer is saying is, then it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read some that have suggested that this was what he intended to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Then it happened. His plan happened. He got up, he went, saw this woman bathing. She was beautiful to behold. He inquired for her, and they had an affair. Whether or not that's exactly what it is, I can't say. It's a speculation. But I do know this. When David saw her, had he turned and looked at her no more and went back to bed and just put it from his mind, nothing else could have happened from that.
Sure.
But the moment that he saw her, she was very beautiful to behold. I mean, that's not David saying that. That's God telling us.
Right.
She was a beautiful woman. He goes and inquires about this woman, and that's when the problems happen. But all of these things, Wayne, come from the third one. And I'll do my little spiel here, and I'll let you kind of take it because we're running close to time. It takes a prideful man to assume that he could get away with what David did. It takes someone very prideful, number one, to, as a leader of a nation, not fulfill your responsibilities as a leader. Where should David have been but in battle? Right. And had he gone to battle, this wouldn't have happened. What should David have done when he saw the woman except go inside and not thought about it anymore? What should David have done even when he called for her and had the affair and she comes back and says in verse 5, I'm with child? David should have humbled himself and said, we've gone too far. We need to stop. But a prideful man says, no, I can get away with this. I can get out of this. And he calls Uriah home and tries to get Uriah to go in and, be with his wife and then act as if it's his child. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know much about Uriah. I know that evidently they were similar enough that David felt like this was a passable plan.
Yeah.
that it could have been possible to say, well, yeah, that's baby Uriah right there. Looks just like you. But Uriah has integrity, and he's not a prideful man. And he says on multiple occasions, I'm sleeping outside the door, verse 9. I won't do this because the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents, but my lord Joab and the servants are also encamped, and I'm going to go home and eat and drink. And he even says, to lie with my wife. Uriah says something that every husband can understand. I'd love nothing more than to go and be at home and to be with my wife. But I can't do that. That's wrong with the men that I know that are behind in battle. And the contrast here of the King David, God's chosen person, who is saying in this moment, I have so much pride that I can do whatever I want. It just blows my mind that he gets to the point where he even kills Uriah, verses 16 and 17. Wayne, with the final few minutes we've got here, and you can go a little over if you want, that's fine. Tell me your thoughts on the pride of life. What would you do? I got to ask it right. Sorry. Wayne, what would you do if someone asked about the pride of life?
Well, as you set it up, thinking about David, you're right. He knows where he is supposed to be. And if it's the case that, yes, he decided to stay home because of this, then you could easily say, in his mind, he's like, I got this. I can accomplish this. So in his mind, he's working out all of these things. Going back to his eyes are bigger than his head here. You know, he's made this plan, maybe, how this is all going to work out. And so if he has stayed behind for that particular purpose, that also indicates the pride that I can get away with this. Mm-hmm. I'm the king. You know, it's maybe it's the old adage, it's good to be the king. You know, I can make these decisions. I can make these things happen. Clearly, he could make her, be brought to him, and so those were things. But the idea that he could keep covering it up, okay, that didn't work. I'll just have him put to death. That also, sin will find you out, and it found him out, and very clearly, he had to be humbled. And, when Nathan comes to him and starts to explain, you're the man. You're the one who did this. And so the story that he used to get him there, obviously, with the ewe lamb and so forth, but it appealed to a shepherd man.
Right.
To a shepherd boy who was taking care of his father's flock. And so he was able to do that. But when I think of, you go back to what did the woman see? She saw that there was a tree also desirable to make one wise. And how Satan set this whole thing up, you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
Right.
You will be like God. And so that's where he took them in their mind. You'll be like God. David says, I got this. Pride. And Satan won.
Yeah, unfortunately, in that moment, he certainly did. And, of course, God's grace is greater. We can always change and be forgiven of the temptations that we've succumbed to, but
Absolutely.
We're certainly thankful for the time we've had to be together. Welcome to the new What Would You Do If? It's been a while, and we're glad that we have the chance to sit with you again, study together. We are a part of the Scattered Abroad Network, and we're thankful to be recording in the Memphis School of Preaching studios. What a privilege it is. A work of the school, Scattered Abroad, is, and that makes What Would You Do If a work of the school. Yeah. We're grateful for the time we have to be together. Until next time, take care, and God bless.